I am an old woman now, and time has thinned my hair and slowed my steps, but it has not softened my memory. There are moments that never fade, no matter how many years pass, and the night before my son's wedding is carved into me deeper than any scar. People think the most painful moments in a mother's life are loud, dramatic things, shouting, slamming doors, funerals, goodbyes at airports. They are wrong. Sometimes the deepest wounds arrive quietly, whispered close to your ear, spoken softly enough that no one else can hear, but sharp enough to change the course of your life. That evening in New York City, I believed I was standing on the edge of the happiest chapter of my son Caleb's life, and maybe the most meaningful chapter of mine. I had raised him alone for 27 years, through exhaustion that hollowed my bones and sacrifices no one ever applauded. I had given up promotions, said no to friendships, learned how to stretch a paycheck until it felt like paper tearing between my fingers. Also, my boy would never feel abandoned after his father disappeared. To me, his wedding was never just about him marrying the woman he loved. It was proof that all those lonely nights, all that quiet endurance, had led to something good. I arrived at the rehearsal dinner with a small box clutched to my chest. Inside was a scrapbook I had spent weeks making by hand. Every page held pieces of our life together. His first missing tooth. A crooked Mother's Day card. A photograph of him in a borrowed suit on the day he was accepted into law school. I wanted his future wife to see the man she was marrying not as a title or a career path, but as a human being shaped by love and loss. I thought it was a gift any woman would appreciate. Marlo answered the door. She looked flawless, as she always did. Perfect hair, tailored dress, that polished smile she wore like armor. But her eyes were different that night. Cold. Measuring. She did not ask me how I was. She did not look at the scrapbook in my hands. Instead, she stepped closer, invading my space in a way that felt deliberate, and lowered her voice. After tomorrow, she said, you are not part of this family anymore. For a moment, my mind refused to understand the words. I actually smiled, thinking I had misheard her. I asked her to repeat herself. She leaned in again, lips curling slightly, and repeated it slower, as if explaining something obvious to a child. She told me I had done my job. That I had raised Caleb. That once she became his wife, family would mean her, not me. She said I was excess. Baggage. Something embarrassing that needed to be left behind. I stood there holding that scrapbook like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Years of restraint, of swallowing hurt for my son's sake, pressed down on my chest until breathing felt difficult. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her about the nights I cried silently so Caleb would not hear. About the jobs I turned down because they required travel. About the way I had stitched his Halloween costumes by hand because store-bought ones cost too much. But none of that mattered to her. She had already decided who I was. She patted my arm and told me not to come to the wedding. She said it would spare everyone discomfort. She said tomorrow was about her life beginning, not mine lingering. I do not remember leaving the restaurant. I do not remember the drive home. I only remember sitting on the edge of my bed that night, the scrapbook open on my lap, my hands shaking so badly I thought I might tear the pages. Every photograph was a reminder that love does not end when a child grows up. It simply changes shape. Yet I was being told that love now made me inconvenient. Unwelcome. Disposable. Tears fell onto the pages, blurring faces I knew by heart. Somewhere beneath the heartbreak, something else stirred. Not rage. Not hatred. A quiet, steady resolve. If I was not part of their family after tomorrow, then tomorrow I would not be there at all. When I made that decision, I did not know it would change everything. I thought I was choosing disappearance. I did not realize I was choosing the truth. When people look at me now, they see only an old woman with soft hands and slow steps, someone whose life has already passed its most important chapters. What they do not see is the weight I have carried quietly for decades, the kind of weight that reshapes your spine and your soul without ever leaving a visible mark. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what came before, because my absence on that wedding day did not begin with Marlowe's cruelty. It began 27 years earlier, the night my son's father walked out and never came back. Caleb was 7 years old when it happened. He stood in the hallway of our small apartment in Albany, clutching a plastic dinosaur with one arm and rubbing his eyes with the other, asking me when his father would be home. I remember kneeling in front of him, forcing a smile that felt like glass cutting into my face, telling him his dad was just busy, that everything would be fine. I lied because I did not know how to explain abandonment to a child who still believed promises were unbreakable. That night, after Caleb fell asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table until sunrise, realizing that from that moment on, every responsibility would belong to me. I became everything at once. The provider, the protector, the disciplinarian, the comfort when nightmares came. I worked wherever I could find steady hours, mostly in places no one dreams of ending up. Cafeterias, cleaning crews, temporary contracts that ended just as I learned everyone's names. There were days I came home so exhausted I fell asleep in my coat, shoes still on, while Caleb did his homework beside me. I learned how to stretch a single paycheck across rent, groceries, school supplies, and emergencies that never warned you before arriving. I learned which bills could be paid late and which ones could not. I gave up things without announcing it to anyone. Vacations became stories I told Caleb about places we might go someday. Promotions were declined because they required evenings or weekends away from him. Friendships faded because I was always too tired to return calls. Loneliness became something I folded neatly and tucked away, like an old coat you cannot afford to throw out because you might need it someday. I told myself that love was enough. That love would carry us through. And in many ways it did. Caleb grew into a boy who tried hard not to ask for much. He brought home crooked drawings and gold stars like trophies. On Mother's Day, he made cards with glue still wet, telling me I was the strongest person he knew. When he said things like that, I felt rich beyond measure. Those moments paid me back for every sacrifice I never spoke aloud. As he grew older, I watched him become thoughtful, observant, quietly ambitious. He studied late into the night, not because I demanded it, but because he wanted a future different from the one we had survived. When he told me he wanted to become a lawyer, he said it was because he wanted to protect people who could not protect themselves. He said he learned that from watching me. I carried that sentence with me through every hard day that followed. So when Caleb introduced me to Marlowe 3 years ago, I wanted to believe she would become the daughter I never had. She was beautiful, confident, sharp in a way that drew attention the moment she entered a room. Caleb looked at her like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked about happiness. I told myself that love sometimes arrives wrapped in personalities very different from our own. At first, she was polite to me in public. She smiled, used my name, complimented my cooking. But when Caleb stepped away, her tone shifted. Conversations shortened. Questions about my life never came. She spoke to me as if I were an obligation rather than a person, something to be managed carefully rather than understood. I excused it. I told myself she was nervous, or busy, or simply not good at connecting with older people. Over time, the small dismissals became harder to ignore. She corrected me in front of others. She made jokes about traditions Caleb and I had shared for years, calling them outdated or quaint. On his birthday, when I brought out the chocolate cake I had baked every year since he was 10, she took the knife from my hand and said he was on a new diet now. She laughed. He laughed too, a little too quickly. I saw guilt flicker across his face, but I swallowed my hurt. That is what mothers do. We swallow things so our children do not have to choke on them. The engagement should have brought us closer. Instead, it built a wall I could not climb. Wedding plans happened around me, not with me. I was not invited to fittings or tastings or conversations that mattered. When I offered help, Marlo smiled tightly and told me everything was under control. Just show up and look nice, she said, as if my role in my own son's life had been reduced to decoration. Looking back now, I see what I refused to see then. Marlo spoke about Caleb less as a man and more as a future. His salary. His career trajectory. His potential. At parties, she introduced him by what he would become, not who he was. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself love sometimes sounds like ambition. I told myself not to interfere. I did not realize that by staying silent, I was slowly being erased. The morning of the wedding arrived without ceremony, without grace, slipping into my apartment like an unwelcome guest who knows exactly where you hide your fear. I woke before dawn, not because of excitement, but because my body had learned long ago to rise early when something heavy waited for me. For a few seconds, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city outside my window. Cars passed. Somewhere, a siren wailed and faded. Life was moving forward, indifferent to the decision that was tearing me apart from the inside. Habit carried me into the kitchen. I filled the kettle. I laid out the pale blue dress I had bought months earlier, the one Caleb once said made me look younger, the one I imagined wearing as I watched him stand at the altar. I even poured coffee into my favorite mug before Marlo's voice crept back into my mind, quiet and precise, cutting through the fog of routine like a blade. After tomorrow, you are not part of this family anymore. My hands began to shake. I sat down at the small kitchen table, the steam from the coffee rising between me and the truth I could no longer avoid. If I went to that church, I would be smiling through humiliation. I would be pretending that love did not have conditions, that respect could be negotiated away. I would be sitting quietly while my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. For 27 years, I had endured things silently so my son would not have to. This time, silence felt like betrayal, not of him but of myself. My phone lit up. Messages stacked one after another. Relatives checking in. Old friends sending hearts and congratulations. Then Caleb. His name on the screen nearly broke me. Mom, we're heading to the venue. Everyone is asking where you are. You not running late, are you? I turned the phone face down, my chest tight, my instincts screaming at me to grab my keys and drive into the city, to do what mothers are supposed to do and show up no matter the cost. I stood, paced the apartment, sat again. I walked to the bedroom and pulled the scrapbook from under the bed, running my fingers over its worn edges. I had imagined giving it to him the night before the wedding, imagined us laughing softly as we turned the pages together. Now it felt like a relic from a life that was being rewritten without my consent. I slid it back into its box. He would not see it today. Maybe he never would. The phone rang. I let it ring. Again. And again. Each vibration felt like a small hammer striking my resolve. When the voicemail notification appeared, I pressed play despite myself. Caleb's voice was tight, edged with worry. Mom, where are you? Marlo said you weren't feeling well, but I know that's not true. Please call me back. Please. I pressed the phone to my chest, tears soaking into my sweater, the instinct to protect him battling with the need to protect what little dignity I had left. At 10 o'clock, there was a knock at my door. My sister stood there, already dressed for the wedding, her hair perfectly done, her eyes wide with disbelief. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. What are you doing? She demanded. The ceremony starts soon. Everyone is asking about you.
I shook my head slowly, the motion feeling heavier than it should have. I am not going.
Her reaction came fast.
Shock.
Anger. Fear. She called me irrational. She reminded me that Caleb was my only son, that this day would never happen again. When I told her what Marlowe had said to me the night before, the words seemed unreal even as I spoke them aloud. My sister's face changed. The anger drained away, replaced by something close to horror. She sat down heavily, staring at the floor, whispering that she could not believe it. She warned me that people would talk. That they would say I abandoned my son on his wedding day. I told her they were free to say whatever they wanted. I had been judged before.
I would survive it again.
When she left, shaking her head, I watched from the window as she hurried to her car, disappearing into a day that no longer included me. At 11, the church bells began to ring.
I imagined Caleb standing somewhere inside, adjusting his tie, scanning the room for my face.
The thought nearly undid me. I closed my eyes and sat very still, letting the sound wash over me like a final test of my resolve. This was what choosing myself felt like. It was not empowering. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, lonely, and terrifying. I believed that by staying home, I was stepping out of my son's story. I believed that when the vows were spoken, I would be officially erased, just as Marlowe intended. I did not know that my absence would become the loudest presence in that room. I did not know that while I sat alone in my small apartment, the truth was already pushing its way into the light, ready to tear apart the carefully staged future I had been told I no longer belonged in. I did not learn what happened inside that church all at once. The truth arrived in fragments, jagged and breathless, carried to me through shaking voices and broken sentences, as if the day itself had shattered and people were picking up the pieces with trembling hands. At exactly noon, when I was still sitting in the same chair by the window, my phone rang again. This time, I answered. It was my sister. She did not bother with greetings. She did not even say my name at first. She just said, in a voice so unsteady I barely recognized it, "The wedding isn't happening." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her, just as I had misheard Marlowe the night before. I asked her to repeat herself. She did, slower this time, as if the words themselves were too heavy to carry all at once. The ceremony was cancelled. People were leaving. Something had gone terribly wrong. I remember gripping the edge of the table because my legs suddenly felt weak. My first thought was not relief. It was fear. I asked her what had happened, whether Caleb was hurt, whether someone was sick, whether this disaster had somehow been blamed on me already. She told me to sit down, told me to breathe, told me I needed to hear this before it spread everywhere else. What followed sounded like something pulled from a bad television drama, the kind I never had time to watch because real life was always demanding more of me. 30 minutes before the ceremony, Caleb had been waiting in a small side room at the church, surrounded by groomsmen trying to keep things light. He was nervous, she said, pacing, checking his phone, asking if anyone had heard from me. He was worried, not angry. Worried. Then his best friend, a man he had known since childhood, burst into the room without knocking. He looked pale, almost sick. He held out his phone and said there was something Caleb needed to see before it was too late. On the screen were photographs. Not old ones. Recent ones. Marlowe, wrapped around another man, smiling in ways she never smiled in family photos. The timestamps were unmistakable. 2 weeks earlier. The man in the pictures was not a stranger. He was Marlowe's boss, the same one she had described endlessly as a mentor, a professional guide, someone who helped her grow. Caleb stared at the screen, unable to speak. My sister said his face drained of color as realization after realization hit him at once. The late nights.
The locked phone.
The dismissive laughs whenever he questioned her. None of it had been paranoia. It had been truth. But the affair was only the first crack. As guests began to fill the pews, whispers spread, carried by people who suddenly felt complicit in something ugly. Marlowe's maid of honor, already unsteady from nerves and champagne, let something slip that should never have been said aloud. This wedding, she said, wasn't just about love. It was about timing. About money. About securing a future while Caleb's career was just beginning to rise. Someone else mentioned the prenuptial agreement. Not in the vague, sensible way people usually talk about such things, but in specifics that made stomachs turn.
Clauses. Percentages.
Control. Marlowe's family had pushed hard for it, insisting it was standard, protective, harmless. But as pieces came together, it became clear that the document was designed not to protect my son, but to siphon his future earnings into their failing finances. When Caleb finally confronted Marlowe in the bridal suite, she was standing there in her gown, radiant and rehearsed, ready to walk down the aisle. He held up the phone and demanded an explanation. She tried to laugh it off at first, calling the photos misunderstandings, claiming they were taken out of context. But lies collapse quickly when faced with evidence, and the room fell silent as her story unraveled. Then Caleb said something that made my sister's voice break when she told me. He asked Marlowe why she had told his mother she was no longer family. The question stunned her. She had not expected that. She had assumed her words would disappear into the silence she demanded from me. Instead, they had come back to her at the worst possible moment. Marlowe reacted the way people do when control slips through their fingers. She turned sharp, defensive, angry. She accused me of poisoning him against her, of refusing to let go, of being jealous and manipulative. But for the first time, her performance fell flat. The mask she wore so effortlessly had cracked, and everyone in that room could see it. At 11:15, Caleb walked into the church alone. He did not shout. He did not explain in detail. He simply announced that there would be no wedding. That his trust had been betrayed. That the ceremony was cancelled. Gasps rippled through the room. Marlowe's parents protested loudly, accusing him of humiliation, of cruelty. But the truth had already escaped. No amount of outrage could force it back into hiding. By the time my sister finished telling me all of this, my hands were trembling, not with shock, but with something closer to awe. I had stayed home believing I was choosing erasure. Instead, my absence had created a void that could not be ignored, a silence loud enough to expose everything Marlowe had tried to bury. I had not ruined the wedding. I had simply refused to participate in a lie. As I sat there listening, one realization settled over me with unexpected clarity. The words Marlowe had whispered to me the night before had not been a warning. They had been a confession. She never intended for there to be room for truth, or for me, in the life she was building. And now, standing amid the wreckage of her own design, she had no one left to erase but herself. I thought that once the wedding collapsed, once the truth about Marlowe's betrayal surfaced, the story would naturally end there. I believed that exposure would bring closure, that shame would silence cruelty, that people would look at the facts and understand. I underestimated how desperate people become when the future they planned collapses in front of them. I did not yet understand that when someone loses control, they do not retreat quietly. They rewrite the story until they are no longer the monster, and someone else takes that place instead. By evening, my phone would not stop buzzing. Messages from neighbors, distant relatives, old co-workers I had not spoken to in years. Some were gentle, asking if I was all right. Others were cautious, probing, already shaped by rumors they had begun to hear. I made the mistake of opening social media. There it was, spreading faster than truth ever does. Headlines stripped of context. comments filled with assumptions. A picture of Marlo in her ruined wedding dress, mascara streaked, eyes wide with practiced heartbreak. Beneath it, words that turned my stomach. Some mothers don't know when to let go. Just like that, the narrative shifted. The affair became background noise. The predatory prenup vanished from conversation. The focus moved to me. The aging, overbearing mother who supposedly could not stand to see her son choose another woman. It was a story people understood easily because it was familiar, comfortable, and cruel in a way that required no effort to believe.
A bitter old woman made a convenient villain.
I received messages that night calling me manipulative, jealous, toxic. Strangers who had never met me felt entitled to tell me what kind of mother I was. Even people I had known for years asked careful questions, the kind that pretend neutrality but already lean toward judgment. Did you really try to talk him out of the marriage? Did you say things about her before the wedding? Their doubt cut deeper than the insults from strangers. 2 days later, the situation escalated from whispers to threats. A thick envelope arrived in my mailbox, stamped with legal language meant to intimidate. Marlo's family was threatening to sue me. Defamation. Emotional damages. Interference with contractual relations. I sat at my kitchen table reading the letter again and again, my hands trembling not from fear of the words, but from the audacity behind them. They were accusing me of ruining a financial arrangement, not a marriage. Even then, the truth peeked through their lies. I brought the letter to a friend of mine who worked in a law office downtown, a woman who had watched me struggle for years and never once doubted my character. She skimmed it, then looked up at me with quiet fury. "This is intimidation," she said. "They're trying to scare you into silence." When she explained what interference with contractual relations actually meant, my blood ran cold. This was never about love. It was about money, control, leverage. And they had lost all three. The harassment did not stop. Anonymous messages poured in. Some vicious. Some threatening. Others dripping with fake concern. I learned quickly how many people enjoy cruelty when they believe it is justified. Caleb came over one afternoon, pale and exhausted, holding a letter of his own. They were threatening him too. If he did not publicly clear Marlo's name, they would drag both of us through court, drain him before his career even began. I looked at my son, the boy I had once carried on my hip while counting grocery money in my head, now sitting across from me trying to protect me from people who wanted to destroy us. Something hardened inside my chest. I had stayed quiet my entire life. I had absorbed blame, humiliation, loneliness, because silence felt safer than conflict. But silence was no longer neutral. Silence was surrender. That night, lying awake in the dark, I remembered something Marlo had once said to me with a knowing smile. "Perception is everything." At the time, it sounded like arrogance. Now I understood it was strategy. She had built her world on appearances, on controlling how others saw her. If perception was the weapon she chose, then truth would be mine. I realized then that I was done being polite. Done being invisible. Done allowing myself to be rewritten as a villain so others could escape accountability. I had proof. Emails. Screenshots. Legal documents that exposed not just infidelity, but calculated exploitation. I had spent a lifetime protecting my son quietly. This time, protection required my voice. And for the first time in many years, I was no longer afraid to use it. The moment I decided to stop hiding, everything changed. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in slow, irreversible steps, the way real battles are won. I did not wake up one morning suddenly brave. I woke up tired of being afraid. There is a difference. Fear tells you to stay quiet so you can survive. Exhaustion tells you that survival without dignity is just another kind of loss. With my friend's help, I began gathering everything I had ignored for the sake of peace. Old emails Caleb had saved because something in him had felt uneasy but not yet alarmed. Messages where Marlowe's tone shifted depending on who was watching. Copies of the prenuptial agreement her father had drafted, thick with clauses that read less like a marriage contract and more like a business acquisition. When we laid it all out on the table, the picture was no longer blurry. It was damning. A financial investigator confirmed what the documents hinted at. Bankruptcies buried under new company names. Lawsuits quietly settled. Debts stacked so high they needed Caleb's future income to stay hidden. My hands shook as I listened, not because I was shocked, but because every cruel word Marlowe had ever spoken to me suddenly made sense. I was never the problem. I was an obstacle.
A witness who knew my son too well to be fooled forever.
We did not rush. Truth is strongest when it is patient. A journalist who specialized in financial misconduct agreed to review the evidence. When the article was published, it did not scream. It did not insult. It simply laid out the facts in careful, unforgiving order. The affair. The timing. The prenup.
The money trail.
It showed how a cancelled wedding was not a tragedy, but a narrow escape. The reaction was swift and brutal. The same people who had called me controlling now called Marlowe calculating.
Sympathy shifted like a tide turning under a full moon.
Messages arrived apologizing for doubting me. Strangers wrote to say they had been raised by single mothers too, that they recognized the quiet strength in my story. I read every message slowly, not with satisfaction, but with a strange calm. I had not fought to be praised. I had fought to be seen truthfully. Marlowe's family went silent. Threats stopped. Lawsuits vanished before they ever materialized. Their power depended on secrecy, and secrecy does not survive daylight. Caleb, though still wounded, began to breathe again. He threw himself into his work, not to escape pain, but to rebuild himself on solid ground. Some evenings, we sat together on the porch, saying very little, letting shared presence do the work words could not. One night, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled, he reached for my hand. He told me he was sorry for not seeing sooner. I told him he had nothing to apologize for. Love blinds people, and he had loved sincerely. That was never his fault. I reminded him that walking away before the vows was not failure. It was courage. I am old now.